Welcome to the Teaching That Counts podcast. As always, I'm your host, Abel Maesis. I'm an instructional coach here in Ceres Unified School District. Today, we are talking about the Building Thinking Classrooms book, and we are looking at chapters 12 and 13. So once again, I have a great group of teachers with me to talk about and go deep dive into these chapters. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Sarah Mucha, Central Valley High School.
Grant McCormick, also Central Valley High School.
Diana Andrade, Argus High School.
Tucker Schwarberg, Ceres High School.
Elvis Delgado, Ceres High School.
All right, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining me today. Let's go and dive right into chapter 12. I know we've been really looking forward to some of these chapters here, especially chapter 12 and 13, where we talk about evaluation and what we evaluate in a thinking classroom. So I'll go and get us started on this. We're really looking at chapter 12 really resonated with me because we are looking at competencies. And when we talk competencies in math, we're really talking math practices. And so this chapter really focused on how do we evaluate the students in terms of the math practices. Like, that's something that we should value because, you know, when he talked about here, what are three things that appear every time? Perseverance, willingness to take risks, and ability to collaborate. But how do we evaluate those things, right? For years, mathematics, we would just like give a test and we're just looking at content. But we know that we really want students to be able to, especially in a thinking classroom, be problem solvers, persevere through problems, and really hit all of those math practices that we are trying to get students, those standards for math practice, trying to get students to do. So I found this chapter to be great in terms of focusing on those math practices, but I also really got a lot about his rubric style and the things about rubrics. So I'll open it up to some discussion about some things that stuck out to you in this particular chapter.
I really liked how he simplified the rubrics to where it was easy to use, easy to read, easy to interpret. I really liked and identified with the reduction of the number of columns. For years, we've looked at rubrics and it's like a 4-point scale or a 5-point scale. And when I'm constructing these rubrics as a teacher, it's like pulling my own teeth trying to delineate between almost meeting standard and meeting standard, like that 2 and that 3. Like, he preaches having either 2 columns or 3 columns, kind of almost like a Likert scale. And that really, really made it, for me in my mind, simple to communicate, okay, what do I want students to be able to do or to exhibit, and then what's the opposite of that. I also like too how he had the arrow at the top. So rather than putting labels, it's like just on a continuum. Where are you right now? Where do we want to push you? And then obviously showing the direction that you want the students to go. Those were kind of my key takeaways from this chapter, and I really, really appreciated.
Yeah, when you mentioned the arrows, it gets to, he said in the interviews with students, that it revealed many of them were seeing the headings in the initial rubric as descriptions of who they are rather than where they are. And it was especially true for kids that had fixed mindsets. If they were fixed mindset, they often took those headings and thought, oh, that's a description of who I am, not where I am in learning. And so that was different for kids with growth mindset. So I found that fascinating, that the words that we use really matter on the rubric.
So I liked how when he was describing the problem, he talked about we really need to focus on what we choose to evaluate tells the students what we value. And so I thought that was really powerful. The other thing was the traditional rubric. When I saw the picture of it, I got really overwhelmed, but it also kind of reminded me of the framework that we have, which isn't a diss on Ceres. Sometimes it's a lot of writing to take in, and I appreciated his version of a rubric was less words, but like Tucker was saying, the arrow at the top, because it only shows the two ends of the spectrum, and then having the students highlight this middle piece where there aren't necessarily words to gauge where they are. I thought that was an interesting take on the rubrics.
Do you remember our writing rubrics? Do you remember those?
Yeah, I hated those.
No,
I didn't like those.
There was
at all.
so much stuff on there, and it reminds me of in the book where he talks about that he gave teachers the rubrics all like taken apart and asked them to put it back together on where it goes, and they were all different. Like nobody knew where things were supposed to go because there was too much stuff and it was unclear. And it reminded me of that writing rubric. No, whoever, if the district officials that are listening to this, I'm sorry about making comments about the writing rubric.
I think what really resonated with me when I was reading through this is it really connected to our work with Michael McDowell and Hinge that we're doing at Argus. I'm not sure if any of the other sites have got there yet, but he actually visited our site on Tuesday. So I was able to share some of what I read here with him and how it tied into the co-creation of that criteria. So I think that's really where you get the your bang for your buck, is letting students define what is good behavior, what is it that you're looking for, right? What is that ultimate outcome? And then what is the opposite of that? And it can be as easy as the T-chart as he shows, on, which page is that at? I just had it. Just a fast T-chart that the students created on page 220, right? This is good behavior. These are things or good examples of collaboration, if that's what you're measuring, and then, or perseverance, whatever that is. And then this is the opposite of that, right? Not so good. So I actually had a conversation with him and my administrator regarding this chapter, and it was really good to think about. And I told him I was going to be bringing it back to this group, because if we are evaluating what we value, how does that, or does it, end up in their grade somehow? So I just kind of wanted to bring that to this group for us to think about. Does that end up in their grade? If we value it, how do we?
Yeah. And I guess that some of that comes back to that the fact that those standards for math practices are standards. So we could evaluate kids on the standards for math practice because those are standards that they should be doing. They're a little bit different, right? They're not content. So we have to come up with some way to evaluate them. And I like how I like the rubric. I like how it had two columns, and the column in the middle open up so that way students can kind of highlight where they are. And I like the co-construction. Students can really, they know what is and isn't, right? And I think this could be used. I think I was actually working with a team on using this same idea with the CASP and the ICA work that we've done. The ICA gives you the in the report that the students get, it gives you the claims. It gives you in the 3 claims and how the students did in the 3 claims. And if you read the claims, students can understand what it means to be a problem solver and what it means not to be a problem solver. So you can easily make one of these rubrics with students on each of the claims, and then students can see where they are at in a claim during class. And so that's one way to kind of bring in the CASP idea with these rubrics, because really those claims, with the exception of the concepts and procedures, the other 2 really are the competencies, right? And so we want to get those kids there. Can you grade them? I think you can, but you need to be clear on what that is and how that relates to the standards for mathematical practice. Because you don't want it to be participation points, right? Like, we want to stay away from that. Does he mention grading in this? I think in one of the FAQs he does say something about.
Yeah, on page 223, 2 and 223, at the end of the answer, he says that statement about numbers and letters go in your grade book, not on the rubric. And that's what I enjoyed most about the rubrics, was particularly with our work with proficiency scales in the district and, standards-based teaching and standards-based grading, and what's the distinction between that. There obviously is a connection, but right now I'm just trying to make sure I do the work to learn them separately, I guess, at least at first. And when students see grades and they think about what you was said earlier about who they are and not where they're at, And I think that removing that is a big part of seeing them as where they're at on a spectrum and not who they are.
Yeah. I just used a proficiency scale with a set of students this week. And as I was getting ready and preparing for that lesson, I decided to take those numbers off of the proficiency scale. I took the numbers off and just left the words that were on there. And that was really because I read this. And I thought, I need to take these numbers off. So I see what you're saying. It's on 223. Our research clearly showed, and I had this highlighted, that if you put a number or a letter on a rubric, then the students ignore all other aspects of the feedback that the rubric affords.
Let me go ahead and jump in. As my colleague Sarah was mentioning, talking about the problem, right? Were students willing to persevere, take risks, and collaborate? I was just thinking how close this actually hit home here at Ceres High School, just because we've been talking about this at Guided Coalition, which we've been talking about what a good learner is here. And we're trying to figure out, hey, we want to implement these rules for students to be a good learner, asking questions, is confident in where they are going, can make connections about how their daily lessons connect with other things, can advocate for where their needs are, and use tools around them. And we're trying to advocate all these things for students, but we're not giving them a grade. And I was like, this is exactly what we need. We need to let students know that we are going to grade them on these things, and it's going to be all levels, not just one teacher's doing it in one class and no one else is doing it. We need to go all in on this. So it really jumped into the idea of creating this rubric, and I really like the idea of the rubrics just being simple. And I was thinking 5-week rubric, Monday through Friday, and then if students showing perseverance, if they're taking risks, are they collaborating? And it's we could just highlight those things for them, or they can highlight them for themselves, and that's every classroom where they can see that. And it's how cool would that be where the whole school is doing this, and students say, I'm learning because I'm doing these things.
Right, because the characteristics that we're being asked to evaluate in our math classroom is going to be the same throughout all the classes, not just math classrooms. I also like that he basically said that the total time you spend on co-creating, presenting, and using the rubric is less than 15 minutes, which I'm like, this year, I feel like since I've been reading the book, I've been running out of time. So I don't know if 15 minutes is exactly how long it would take me, but I would hope that that's the amount of time. I could see myself doing this at the beginning of the school year. And then, how he says you're only evaluating 3 groups that period. So that's the only thing that I feel like, okay, we're doing these random groups. And then it's to keep track of which kids. And if you're rotating to random groups multiple times, how do you track that? I feel like the tracking part would be hard if you are rotating multiple times in a period. But I do like the rubrics, and I could see implementing them. I like how he says, if you notice that the kids are kind of slacking in perseverance, pull that rubric out and tape it to their vertical whiteboard. I'm like, okay, so that's what made me think the beginning of the school year would be a good idea, because then you would stockpile, here are these 3 or 4 rubrics, whatever. These are the ones I'm going to focus on for this semester, and make sure that the kids got it.
Yeah, going back to that, I actually jumped into with my students. They had an assessment, and they had a bonus question, which was, what makes a good student? And so they had to write me a complete paragraph, what makes a good student, and just the responses from them was amazing. Just they know what a good student is, and they're willing to do it, but I don't think they know it. Since we're not grading that, they're not willing to put that effort into it. So
we're not holding them accountable
for it. You're right.
It's the accountability
So
part.
right now, my whiteboards are all what makes a good student, and there's keywords, there's sentence frames everywhere. So when we come back on Monday, we're going to roll out the idea of good student and how can we create a rubric using their ideas, and then we're going to use that as we continue the semester.
Co-construct that rubric, and then when they're not doing what they said they were going to do, you post it up. Hey, I see that you struggled here yesterday. Where can you go today to be that student that we talked about?
So does that mean that each period has a different rubric? Because that's the part that I'm like, we have different periods, and different periods have different personalities. They have different traits. So I'm just wondering, are these rubrics going to be different for each class?
That's a great question. Right now, what I'm thinking of doing is I'm going to have my students kind of circle the top 3 for that class period, and I can label them periods 1, 2, and periods 1 technically. And then if my third period class agrees on it, then we'll circle the same 3. But I'm trying to use the same, or trying to direct them into like, let's just use 3, so we can have the same rubric and understand that that's the idea.
Yeah, I think using, teacher tool like that, right? Seeing if you can use the same one for multiple classes, just sharing it with the other class. Or I think directing them to a little bit of direction on where, I think he talked about this too, if like they miss something, you can kind of fill that in, especially if you're framing these around the standards for math practice. I think you're going to end up with some similarities when you're really talking about, persevering in problem solving, right? Standard math, I believe that's math practice 1. Or, what was the other? Modeling with mathematics, right? So if we're modeling with mathematics, they're right in front of me. Yeah. Move your head, Tucker. So if we're modeling with mathematics in math practice 4, what does that look like when I'm doing that in class on a day-to-day basis? And then when we're actually doing those tasks on the boards, you might tell them, today we're looking at this one, and this is what you should be doing for math practice 4. That's the one we're working on today, aside from the content.
Yeah, and when in my capacity as an intervention teacher, I've also helped another teacher with that who teaches juniors, and they're getting ready for state testing. They're doing a little bit of that and looking at their score reports from previous years. And in the problem-solving rubric was what she decided to use that day. And some of the language that came up in the bad indicators was making mistakes. And then she's like, oh, is that a bad thing? And I think, part of reshaping kids to be in a growth mindset could be helping them to see that some of those things that they're afraid of trying are actually good things in that practice.
Wow, that's powerful, man. Because we don't know that until we ask the kids. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Anything else in this chapter? Like I said, I the other thing that I felt was really super powerful was I wrote a sentence here. Oh, at the very end in the last FAQ, he says, all assessments, and I think we're going to go into that in the next chapter here, all assessment and evaluation should be for learning, and some of it will be of learning. And I felt that was powerful as he goes into the next piece and looking at content. This chapter really focused on the competencies. Another person asked, okay, well, how does this help me with attainment of content? It doesn't. This is straightforward. This chapter is about how do we get students doing the things we want them to do rather than looking at the math itself. So let's talk about chapter 13. 13 is how we use formative assessment in a thinking classroom. He points out in the very beginning the difference between formative and summative. You focus on summative assessments in chapter 4, so we'll get to that. This chapter really focuses on formative. How do we gather information from kids? And this is really content-based. The first thing I highlighted was on page 232. When a student completes a test or a quiz and the teacher grades it, how that student performed informs the teacher of what they need to work on with that student. He goes on to talk about, but he says in either case, the teacher can then use the information to inform their teaching, and the student can use it to inform their learning. But a lot of times what happens is the students don't really get the information, and they don't know how to use it to inform their learning. So I think that's what the big kind of theme of this chapter was. And I think we're going to talk about this, but it really hits to what we're doing in Series Unified with Proficiency Scales. This was the Proficiency Scale chapter. So what are you guys' thoughts?
I think the big picture that I saw was a good amount of students don't see the unit as subtopics. They see it as one big thing. And so that also made me think of success criteria and your learning targets and your learning intentions. So that's what I pulled away from this chapter, was that, some kids aren't seeing it as subunits, but I think that if you have the learning targets mapped out for them, it gives a bigger picture of these are all the little things that make this big unit.
I really liked, again, just the structure of the rubric here. for these, and I also, just like Sarah, kind of identified them as learning targets or the success criteria of the unit. And my team had created something similar in the 3 columns outlined on the front of the unit that just says, I can never do this, I can sometimes do this, and I can always do this. And students would just interact with that at the end of the lesson. The challenge for me was changing that and incorporating that at the end of every lesson, making sure that students are reflecting, can you do this? Or when we get to like a unit review, that they're reflecting back on those learning targets and analyzing, okay, where do I need to continue my learning? Where am I still working? Things like that.
On his, what is he calling these?
Tools.
Yeah, the navigating
tool, I think
Yeah.
he calls them.
So
Instruments, instruments for navigating.
Instruments for navigating. He has 3 columns, which I like the 3 theme that we have going, but it's like basic, intermediate, and advanced. So that's pulling on the proficiency scales that we have in Series Unified. But it was interesting because the one on figure 13.3 has, the problem numbers from a unit review. And I thought that was really interesting. However, I remember having a release day with you, Abel, and we talked about not having like a traditional review for classes. Like, we're used to sometimes giving a review that looks exactly like the test. And then, so that's what I thought when I was reading this. And I'm just like, well, how do I pull away from doing a traditional review, but still incorporating this instrument of navigating,
Yeah, and I think that you could kind of marry this with some of the check your understanding questions throughout the unit, rather than having it necessarily be at the end of the unit. Although there needs to be a balance, right? We could still do check your understanding questions at the end of a cycle of learning, right? We want the kids to be able to do, we called them practice problems in the past. We want them to get that, consolidate from the bottom, then debrief and formalize that mathematics, but they also have to practice the mathematics. And at the end of a unit, practicing those mathematical skills, doing some thinking problems is good, but they shouldn't necessarily match the test necessarily, because then all they're doing is mimicking what they did the day before, right? So I can see that. I also thought about that, and I did think, well, how could this work? Not necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but with check your understanding problems. Like, I can go back and say, look, these are the check your understanding problems that were basic, intermediate, and advanced for this subtopic.
Yeah, I guess I was just having a hard time with the timeline. Like, when do you give students this, why am I having a hard time with this word? The navigation instrument. When do you give the students this navigation instrument, and then when do you have them make these marks on here? So like on figure 13.6, he has this key of what each of the symbols mean. And so if students have attempted the problem and answered correctly, they put a check. If they, have a silly mistake, they put an S. And H stands for attempting, but you got help. G was you did it with a group, so collaborative work. X was attempted and it was wrong. N is not attempted at all, like you left it blank. So I guess I'm like, when does a student go through and reflect on this and notice that some of these have multiple marks, like they tried them multiple times? So I guess maybe it does go back to those check for understanding questions, and it's all on the student. Like, you don't give them time in class to do that, because I don't know. That's
he did say that this was, like, this check here was the students' nuanced records of how they performed on each question. And it wasn't necessarily a reflection, it was how they performed, right? Which I believe he talks about in this is a difference between like a self-reflection and a actual, like, giving themselves feedback on where they are on these types of problems.
I also like that he does talk about what do you do with those students that have learning plans, 504 plans, and he says, to use the navigation instrument to help cut through all the noise and really have them focus on maybe like the more basic to intermediate questions to see what their achievable level is.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a nice way to address that.
You know, we have a lot of kids that struggle, but they also struggle motivationally. They struggle with other things. And he does mention, you know, we've done a lot of pushing in this district about having the students know where they are in their learning, where they need to go to be successful, right? And what they need to be able to do to get there. We say that all the time. And I wrote this, underline this. He says another group on whom this navigation instrument was having very little impact were students who didn't appear to care about either the learning or the grade. Some of these students were performing at a lower end of the respective classes. For these students, information about where they are and where they are going wasn't helping them to move forward. So that's not a silver bullet, right? There's a lot of other things that go into getting these kids to be successful. And I know I was thinking of Diana when I was reading this, because you work with a lot of students that have come from that place where there was low motivation. And this isn't really like, this is in and of itself isn't going to help them. But I know that you put a lot of effort and time into motivating the kids in different ways.
Exactly. I read this a couple of times as well when I went through this chapter, but I want to start with the 10 to 20% that it said it didn't have an effect on, because they already saw those subtopics. So I thought that was interesting, right? The 10 to 20% of the students that already understood it, and the rubric didn't matter, right? Then they said the 50 to 70% of the students that they saw drastic improvement in. And then the other group, April, were the ones that you were just mentioning, right? The ones that didn't appear to care about their learning or their grade. And then he also mentions another group. It's not that they didn't care, but they thought, well, I got a B. That's good enough. Why should I go and do all this extra work, right? I'm happy with my B. My mom's happy with the B. And he said, you know, technically you can't argue with that, right? If that's where
right.
if they're happy and they're content there, then that's, you know, that's okay. You know, good enough, in quotes, as he says. So, yeah, it definitely is not, you know, a magic bullet, but I think you have to, you know, you have to try to hit as many of those kids at those moments that you can.
Yeah.
You know, and for some students, if they see content and they're like, hey, you know what? I think I get this. And, you know, then there might be another area of content that they're like, they can't, you know, they have a difficult time accessing it. You know, so you really have to capture what works for the student, I think. And, you know, like you said, try to do a lot of motivation. I do like the open up self-assessments that they have. I didn't look at them to see exactly how they matched up. I know they don't have specific examples, but I know that they're very clear. Like you know, with my success criteria, I don't feel like I'm there yet. I think there's 3 levels, isn't there? I was looking around for a book if I could grab one, but yeah, and I do try to use those with the kids, and especially now that I have the
proficiency scales.
Proficiency scales. Yeah. Thank you. The proficiency scales, that I think I've been using more with my students.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you know, this is where we are, and I'm tending to lean more towards that. But I'm looking at this like, how can we incorporate some of those examples into those a little bit more?
Yeah.
From our content.
Thank you for that. So I want to highlight a couple of things here that I wouldn't say are a passion of mine, but I found very interesting that I think that if we can talk about. So the first is that the labels. We talked a little bit about the labels in the rubric, and he talks here about the way that we use the words in our labels here. He uses basic, intermediate, and advanced, but he does talk about how we want to focus the words on the tasks, not on the students' abilities, and that the marks that they make, the check, the S, the H, and the X, and the N, those are their being able to say where I am at with this type of level of task. And so thinking about the tasks that we do and labeling those as basic, intermediate, advanced. I think when we went to NCTM, we did what, chili peppers or hot spice? It was Taco Bell hot sauce, right? What were they labeled? Mild, hot, and fire, right? And so students can connect to that really easily. Hot, mild, or mild, hot, and fire. So that was one thing I was thinking about. Here's the other thing. That I worked with a lot of 12th graders over my career. Gosh, there were 3 things I really want to talk about. I worked with a lot of 12th graders over my career, and he mentions in one of the FAQs about how we give the students the list of the subtopics, but at some time they need to be able to see the unit as a unit of subtopics, because that's what they're going to need in college. That's what prepares them for making those connections in post-secondary education. And he talked about that in 245. So that was something that was really, I think, really important to me. And the last thing, which really is where I want to talk to you guys about, we do a lot of things in this district with learning intentions and success criteria. And he talks in this FAQ on page 246. The question that he gets is, in my jurisdiction, we have been told that we should be stating the learning goal or outcome for that lesson at the beginning of the lesson. Doesn't that take care of helping students to see the unit as study as a collection of subtopics? He says, in theory, yes. In reality, it doesn't. And he goes on, and this is the most important piece I thought here. He says, until your students get to experience the mathematics and see how the different tasks in this subtopic are connected and are different from the other tasks, these kind of statements aren't going to mean much. Names of concepts should come after experiences with concepts. This is in part why consolidation from the bottom is so effective. And he gave you an example. It's like, oh, next chapter you're going to blah, 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 blah. And it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But when you experience that.
You don't know what a data gathering paradigm is?
Yeah, no, I don't know what data gathering paradigm is. He says that. So he says, in 10th grade student, today we're learning how to factor trinomials where a leading coefficient is not 1. Makes as much sense as me saying in the next chapter we're doing data things. So, I think we've been doing it for a long time. Here's our learning intention and here's our success criteria at the very beginning. And to them, it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. But if we consolidate from the bottom and then say, today you were supposed to be learning to do this, and this is how you know you're successful. Were you there? For years, I was always like, I don't want to give away the card trick. I want students to get an experience, and then it comes like, look at the math we did. So I felt a little bit validated with this. I know that's a little bit against what a lot of we've been doing in this district. So I just wanted your thoughts on that. And please don't get me in trouble. Any of you that are listening out there that are admin.
My work with students this year with developing success criteria, I exactly felt that same way. Like, how can I expect the students to know what the success criteria looks like or is if we haven't even done this, right? So what I did was probably about midway through the term, then I had them go back and look to see, like, okay, what have we covered and what does success look like? Or maybe give them assessment questions or questions that, we're going to be appearing on their test and have them look at it and say, okay, well, yeah, we've done this and this is what I need to do. And we haven't done this yet. And so that, I think, helped because it made more sense. Instead of me just giving the test or the assessment and having them look to see what the success criteria would be and come up with that, there would be no way that they could create that on their own. So that's something I've already put into practice.
Oh, cool. Thanks for sharing that.
And I think more too, it's more of a and answer rather than a or. I think it kind of just depends upon what the topic is. Like, there are some, inquisitive based lesson that you really don't want to give away the card trick. And then there's some that are just very much very straightforward. Okay, this is what we're learning today, especially if they do have that background knowledge or, experience, then you can you can lay it out there so you have that clarity for them. And then two, with success criteria, yes, some of it, like I'm going over it, it doesn't make any sense. And so I do that briefly at the beginning of the lesson, but then I always try to go back during the lesson. Okay, this is the first, your first step. You want to be able to accomplish this in order to reach the next stage. So I think all of it, right, is just another tool in the tool belt, and you figure out when you're going to utilize that tool and how.
Yeah, I did something Michael McDowell did where he didn't show the learning, like I didn't show the learning intention and success criteria until after we had a task problem up there, and I asked the students, what do you think we're learning about today based on what we have? And they thought, well, maybe we're learning this, maybe we're learning that, maybe we're learning this. Okay, great. Let me show you what we're learning here. Here's a learning intention success criteria. So they had a chance to at least look at the task, make some connections of what they thought they were going to be learning, and then most of them were right. That is exactly what we're learning. And then we get into the main task. And that worked out really well for the students to make that connection. But I didn't show them, I didn't tell them what we were learning first. I let them kind of think about that first. And Michael McDowell did that, and I thought that was pretty. By the way, Michael McDowell is, I think he still teaches math, but he has a math background. That was what he was originally teaching.
Yeah, I want to add to that. Hopefully I don't get in trouble for saying this, but see what happens.
It's a safe space that's public.
I appreciate
Elvis.
it. Appreciate it.
Thousands and thousands of people will be listening to this podcast.
Hopefully. I know we have our learning intention success criteria, and I think it's awesome that students get to see what they're learning, right? They get to understand, like, walking in and, hey, today I'm going to be learning about systems of equation, and I got to be able to do this, this, and this. But there's so many times I said this to my students, and half the class is listening. They're on their cell phones. They're like, well, what's the point of this? He's going to go over it. I'm going to learn after he says it. So I kind of started modifying my approach to this. And so, I talked about it last time. I'm using Cornell notes with my students now. So my exit ticket is actually 2 or 3 questions where they write on the side. So for example, it would be, what is the system of equations? And then they have to show me a problem of what system of equation would be. Draw me a system of inequalities, and then they'll have to show on their notes, like going back to what we did on our workbooks, go ahead and write that. And that is where they learn, and then they summarize, and that's where we end. But it goes back to the learning intentions to, like, this is where I learn. Yes. Instead of them having to really process and being in class, I have no idea what we're going to do, but now I know what I just accomplished.
Yeah, by no means are we saying to not put up the learning intention success criteria. It's just finding the right time that is strategic, right? It might not be at the very beginning. It might be after a first task, or it might be in the middle or in the end. It really depends on the situation and the task and the mathematics that we're doing. I think that's what we're trying to say here.
There have been a couple of times where I've been intentionally vague in the success criteria, and that might not sound great, but going back to what we were saying about the rubrics and the math practices. Okay, I'll be successful today by making sense of problems and persevering in solving them. And then when the time's right, because I am trying not to give away the card trick, as you said, go change the success criteria later, but just give them that to start with so they see, okay, we're tapping into this practice, and maybe the content reveals itself a bit later.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back to that consolidating from the bottom, right? We're using what the students come in with to build their mathematics up. And so I love that idea. It reminds me, Elvis, what you talked about here, that very last, one of these last FAQs I thought was so cool. He says at the end of, how can we know that I'm doing a good job helping my students know where they are and where they're going? He says, at the end of the unit study, ask your students to make a review test on which they'll get 100%. So make a review test that you'd get 100%. And then make one that you'd get 50. They'll know where they are, right?
That's great. That is
They'll know exactly where they are if they can do that. So, and they'll know what they don't know if they know the problems that they're going to get 50% on. I thought that was such a cool idea. And I think that's like a neat way to do a review.
Yeah, that is cool. I highlighted that just now as you were reiterating that, because that is interesting take. I've never done that. I've had them create a review, but I've never posed it in that way, right? That you get 100% on. One of the things that I do also is at the end of the class period, I'm like, okay, guys, this was our learning intention today. And then I will randomly select some students. I tend to have smaller classes. So sometimes I let everybody share something that they learned, or something maybe that they still have a question about. So I do try to kind of wrap it up that way and maybe touch base and make them think about, okay, this is what we were supposed to be doing today. What did I learn, or what did I do to help me get there?
So with the part of this where he says names of concepts should come after experiences with concepts, it reminded me of the experience first, formalize later.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just wondering and curious from an admin perspective how they would feel about this learning intention not being there right at the start of class. Because so if they want to phone in, no, I'm just
yeah. We need to do this live, right? We need to do with a phone number. Yep.
Because I feel like we have a site visit coming up. People are going to be looking for that learning goal, your objective, your success criteria, and like if it's not on the board or if it's not on every slide, like they're going to say something in the wrap up, So I'm just wondering, I do feel like sometimes the success criteria does give away things. So I have in the past done what Grant said, where you use your math practices as the success criteria, but I do what Tucker does. I say it in the beginning knowing that they're not really going to know what this is, and then I try to bring it back after they've done a couple problems. I just, like for instance, today my students had to derive the equation of a circle, and my success criteria was that they were going to use Pythagorean theorem to derive it. So then it's like we talked about, okay, what do we remember about Pythagorean theorem? So I tried to like explain the success criteria a little bit, and then I had some building blocks of like set up these triangles use the Pythagorean theorem use the picture of this right triangle to set up the Pythagorean theorem, and then I transferred all that and then tried to bring it back again, like, okay, so this is what we did, like this is what you guys did. Okay, so now let's apply it. But yeah, I'm curious what the admin take would be on that.
Well, I do know some admin listen to this podcast, so I'll see
Paul
what they
Rudehauser,
say. Yeah.
What do you think?
And be a special guest.
Right, special guest next time. And I can say this, though. Michael McDowell, we had admin at a day where Michael McDowell was here, and he did something like that, and he talked about that. And I think some of the coaches kind of looked over at the admin to see what they were how their reaction is. I hope that this podcast and other types of professional development also help admin see what we're talking about, and why I think it's meaningful for us to find strategic places for students to be able to think and then grasp what we're having them be successful on. So hopefully, all right, we've talked for quite a long time now that I'm looking at my clock here. So I think it's time for us to wrap this up, if that's okay. We're at the end, folks. We have one more session. We're looking at chapter 14 and 15 next time. We're finally going to look at how we grade students and how do we grade kids in a thinking classroom. Thank you, all of you, for being here with me today, and we will see you next time.